Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on Experience Christian Church podcast this week. I am Diane Karshner, your host, and we're joined by Matt Silver, our pastor here at Experience, and our friend, colleague, and Bible scholar, Lee Magnus, who can help us dissect all the things that we don't understand. Thanks for joining us. This week, we're going to be talking about something that's very near and dear to all of our hearts. And we rarely want to talk about materialism and toxic things in our life. But first and most important, the question of the week: what is your favorite snack, Matt and Lee?
Well, I already gave mine. I already gave mine away in the sermon.
Yeah.
Past Sunday, Dorito chips, and to be honest, any kind of salty snack would do fine, but Doritos are at the top of the list.
All right, Matt.
I'm going to go with dark chocolate chips. That's my favorite. I mix it with anything: peanuts, raisins, bananas, fruit.
Dark chocolate chips. You mean chips with chocolate on them?
Just dark chocolate chips, like a bag of them, because it's the cheapest way to get chocolate. And I just take a handful and mix it with something, some fruit, raisin, something I love. Yogurt. I throw it in everything.
Now, my wife says that there are actually health benefits to dark chocolate.
There you go.
Is she just saying that because that's her favorite snack, or what?
Well, I've heard that, and I'm sticking to it. I'm not going to Google that.
It could be a quantity issue. That a little bit is okay.
I never heard anybody say that about Dorito chips.
No.
My favorite is Ruffles have ridges, those potato chips with the little ridges, because all the salt gets stuck in the ridges. And then you eat that along with a peppermint patty. Oh. And they could be a frozen one too. It's just, yeah, I can't eat just one of those at all.
Taquitos? Have you guys had taquitos, the spicy chips?
Yes.
They're good too.
Huh. I don't know with a peppermint patty though.
No.
Might soften the spice too much. All right. Enough of that tomfoolery. Let's move on. Okay. So we're talking about materialism and the toxic things that we hang on to in our life that kind of get in the way of us getting closer to God. So Lee, let's start with you. So one of the things that you defined in your sermon on Sunday was that toxic things affect your life when your possessions, I'm reading it so I make sure I get the words, your possessions poison your personal relationship with God, with others, and with ourselves. So poison, it just seems like such a powerful word to use when you're thinking about all the wonderful things you have sitting around you that you purchased or that you lusted after to have. And so give us some insight on what that whole idea of poison actually looks like in our lives. What does it show up as?
Yeah. Let me remind myself and you and all of those who are joining us that I'm not talking about individual material possessions.
Okay.
I'm not trying to say, that object is poison, or, a coin is poisonous. I'm talking about the attitudes, our response, our use, and all that. But your question is, why do I use such an extreme word as poison? And I think there's some good reasons. Number one, poison attacks our system usually. It's a systemic problem. It's not just a topical problem like a cut or something like that. And I really think that is true of materialism as well. It's not just a one and done kind of encounter in our lives. It has a way of kind of getting inside of us and systemically affecting, maybe I should say infecting, many, many different areas of our lives. Another thing about materialism is that it's so subtle. A lot of poisons are subtle. You don't take a poison and immediately fall down dead like in some Agatha Christie mystery show or something like that. It's something that builds in your system over a period of time and eventually harms you. And I think that's also true of materialism. It's kind of subtle because it doesn't feel bad or wrong maybe right from the start, but it kind of builds up in you and infects these relationships. Another thing about materialism is that it seems so appealing at first, often. It doesn't actually taste bad, tastes kind of good, that first taste. But then it moves from being appealing to being addictive. And when it becomes addictive, which materialism does more and more and more, then it starts to have these negative effects. So those are some of the reasons why I think materialism is downright poisonous.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, especially when you described it as systemic, that it kind of gets all through our lives and we really don't realize how it has subtly affected everything. So one of the stories from the Bible that you told was about the rich young ruler, a story that I've heard countless times over my years as a believer, and it always has a different kind of twist to it. So I'm going to ask both of you to react to this, because it's just, there's so much wrapped up in this. There's greed wrapped up in it. There's possessiveness, there's questions. So if I could ask both of you just to comment on how the rich young ruler and materialism go together. How does that teach us how to get through this? Either one of you.
Okay. Well, I think the main point of Jesus' teaching to the rich young ruler is how our use of our possessions, or our misuse of our possessions, or our lack of use of our possessions, affects our attitudes toward other people, and therefore our relationships with people. I shouldn't have said other people, because the first way in which materialism negatively affects attitudes and relationships is with ourselves. I think materialism does a real negative number on self-worth in one of two ways. Either we don't value ourselves, we don't think we have any worth, and so we try to compensate for that by the way we use our possessions. Look, my motorboat's bigger than your motorboat, or whatever, my car is fancier than your car, and that's a subtle but really sad cover for a lack of self-worth.
Okay.
The flip side of that is that we're arrogant. We have a lot of too much self-worth, and try to demonstrate that in the way we use our possessions. Okay. So it does a real harmful number on our attitude toward ourselves. And then, as I said in the sermon that you were quoting that main line from, it poisons our personal relationships, not only with ourselves, but with others and with God.
Okay.
And of course, for the rich young ruler, it hurt his relationship with Jesus, because Jesus desperately wants this young man to follow him and to be a disciple. And it, for him, became the barrier to discipleship.
Yeah. Matt?
Yeah, I really appreciate the story. One of the lines that I always find highly contested is that line, it's easier for, it's easier for the camel to fit through an eye of a needle than a rich man into the kingdom of heaven. And this context really is striking. And it was striking for the disciples to hear. They were aghast by that. And they're like, well, then who can be saved? And then they're like, with man, everything's it's impossible. And so the richness of this text, the shock value at which he says it, I really appreciate how you dig into that. My life application, it had something I thought would be fun to share. It says, should all believers sell everything they own? It says, Jesus does not require this of everyone he met. We are responsible for caring for our own needs and the needs of our families. We should, however, be willing to give up anything if God asks us to do so. This kind of attitude allows nothing to come between us and God and keeps us from using our God-giving wealth selfishly. And then this was the key statement that I loved. It said, if you are relieved by the fact that Jesus did not tell all his followers to sell all their possessions, then you may be too attached to what you have. I thought that was brilliant.
That's strong.
Yeah, because we want to identify with the rich young ruler, we might dismiss it by saying, oh, we're not rich, that's not us.
Yeah.
Or if we acknowledge the fact we have things, we have excess, and that could be a barrier between God. It's like, well, what do I do in this position? What do I do with these things that I have? And really calls you to think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, that whole a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Years and years and years ago, I was taught that a camel could go through the eye of the needle. The eye of the needle was a little teeny gate on the side of the wall. And if the camel got down on its knees and crawled through the little teeny gate, then he could get in. So I always thought that meant that I should, when I pray, I need to get on my knees. So I thought that would get me into heaven, I guess. I don't know. It was just, I have looked for that reference for years since that, because I wanted to, share that with others that I was teaching about this, and I couldn't find it anywhere because it isn't anywhere to be found. So, but what is there a story that Jesus told that would show us how to really get close to God, even though we have material things? Lee, you would probably know better than I, but there must be a story in there somewhere.
Well, let me make one quick comment on the eye of the needle thing, since you brought it up. If this isn't talking about some tiny gate that camels can crawl through, I don't think camels even crawl. But
I don't think they do.
But you're right. That's a made up story.
Okay.
But Jesus had to meant something by it. And what we have here is a real good example of Jesus' use of deliberate exaggeration. There's a fancy word for it, hyperbole. And Jesus loved to use hyperbole. It had kind of a shock value. It had kind of a little bit of a humor value. It caused you to chuckle a little bit, but mainly the shock value, to say, whoa. And boy, it worked on the disciples, didn't it?
Yeah.
They are in shock because their tradition, the Jewish tradition, kind of tended to view wealth as a blessing from God. And so if you were wealthy, you were in good with God,
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that Jesus says that wealth can be any kind of a barrier really came as a shock to them. So this is a hyperbolic statement by Jesus to try to grab the attention of his listeners. But the question you asked me, is there a positive example of someone who responded to Jesus' teaching about materialism? That's kind of on the flip side of this rich young ruler story. And the fact is, yes, the rich young ruler story is told in Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Huh.
So it was a really important story. It shows up in all three Gospels. And in Luke, in the very next chapter, so rich young ruler is in Luke 18. The very next chapter, Luke 19, is the story of Zacchaeus, a really, really wealthy chief tax collector. And we don't need to teach through that story or even talk through it right now. But let me just commend our listeners and viewers to take a look at chapter 19, verse 1 in Luke. And there you'll see somebody who was as wealthy, if not more wealthy, than the rich young ruler, who did respond to Jesus' call to generosity in a way to counteract the poison of materialism.
Great. Right. I will definitely look that one up.
Okay.
Okay. So you said in the sermon, don't give to get a reaction, react to what has already been given to you. So obviously Jesus has given us salvation. So we need to react to that. But, I was thinking, in the world that we live in with so much materialism around us, in the United States, most of us make more than 2/3 of the world's population as far as wealth and or material goods. And so how do we keep it straight, Lee? How do we, and Matt too, how do we balance this idea of putting God first in a world that screams materialism at us every day?
Matt, you want to grab this one?
Sure. I love I think we talked about this a little bit of a couple weeks ago. It's the stewardship principle. And the stewardship principle is that the things that I have are loaned by me by God. And ultimately, God is that owner. And that's just a healthy lens to look at things. When you were talking earlier, it made me think to the way that money can damage relationships. And it makes me think to how Dave Ramsey says you never loan to family members. And you may have heard that before. He says you give to family members because unintended consequences happen when people don't pay you back what's yours. Yeah. And it's absolutely true. I mean, each of us, if you think about how many families are split over inheritances. And so sometimes we almost have to look at the drastic to see how it changes. And then I appreciate what Lee offered us 2 antidotes to materialism. The first being contentment and the second being generosity. Both those exercises work very well in helping us understand that we cannot be owned by our things. Our things don't own us. The best Christmas movie of all time is what? The Christmas Carol. And it's without a doubt. I mean, look, just Google it. It's the best of all time. And the Christmas Carol, being Scrooge's hold is quite the tale, isn't it? It's quite a cautionary tale of how consumed we can be. And I love that metaphor of the chains walking around with his binders of debts. And it's just helpful for me to put things in that kind of extreme perspective to say the things that I own cannot own me.
Yeah.
Have you seen, that does remind me of one more thing. I'm going on a tangent, which is no surprise to anyone who's listening. Have you read Same Kind of Different as Me? Have you guys seen that story?
Yeah. I think so.
So in the book was just phenomenal. And it's the story of 2 men that are in relationship together. One's a rich philanthropist. The other is a man who does not have many possessions. And they're at lunch together. And he sees the guy's keys sitting out. This is the guy who's wealthy. And he looks at his keys and he says, "Do you own all the things that those keys go to?" And they said he picked it up and saw his house and his car. And he goes, "My office, I guess I do." And then the poor man looked at him and said, "Well, do you own them or do they own you?" What a powerful question.
Yeah.
You know, those things that we carry in our pocket, those keys, do they own us or do we own them? Fascinating.
I like that thought because for me, the response to your question about wealth, and you're right, we are all just so wealthy compared to most people in the world. It's not even funny. But the answer to that question has to do with the way we think about our possessions more than I think the possessions themselves. Jesus talks a lot about what we're seeking, where our priorities are. When you read the Sermon on the Mount, you see that priorities, which mainly has to do with attitude, is a big deal to Jesus. So we get that beautiful, powerful statement: seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So put your priority on fulfilling God's will and responding to God's sovereign reign in your life, and the material possessions we have will kind of fit in to that.
Okay.
Whereas if we seek first wealth or seek first possessions or anything for that matter, power, control, then we're going to be nudging God's will out of the picture, and the end will be disastrous. I think that seeking first idea, or that the prioritizing of our thinking comes out in a number of practical ways. For instance, when Christians make a budget, if you're an individual or a couple or a family, budgets are really good things, I think. And when we budget, I think it's very, very important to talk about kingdom giving first, whether you're in a tithe mode, or if it's not tithing, it's not the 10%, but generosity in general, that doesn't matter. But you start your budget planning with kingdom giving. Now, that kingdom giving may have to be adjusted as you do the rest of your budget. That's okay. Or your kingdom giving may have to be adjusted as you live with your budget throughout the year. Who knows what health issues are going to arise or whatever. So I'm not talking about some kind of legalism when it comes to tithing or budgeting our generosity to create guilt and all that. I'm not going there at all. I'm just saying start with kingdom giving. And that's a kind of prioritizing that I think helps us deal with our wealth. I've, during this weird COVID time that we're living through right now, I'm going to drive-throughs more than I ever have before because I'm not going to restaurants yet. And at drive-throughs, it's interesting because I've been the beneficiary of a couple of cars in front of me paying my bill. Have you guys had that? Yeah. And so I've decided what a good thing that is. And I've decided I'm going to try when I pull up to pay, or as I'm in line, I'm going to look and check out the vehicle behind me, and think first of them. And then when I get up there, I'm going to say, "Can I pay the bill of the car behind me and my bill?" I don't know that I'm going to do that all the time, but at any rate, it's a prioritizing of the other person's need, rather than my own need. So that's my answer to your question. Attitude and priorities.
Great.
So Lee, I got to know, what if it's a minivan?
Full of kids. A soccer team.
I've got to decide on that. Am I going to do it if it's a Lexus? Or am I only going to do it if it's a beat up, rusted out Corolla? Or I don't know.
Yeah.
I got to think about this.
And that's truth. That is truth. All right, 2 more questions. The first one is when the rich young ruler explains to God, explains to Jesus that, but I've got all this stuff. I followed all the rules. And Jesus says to him, but there is one thing you lack. Explain that. You and I talked about this before we started recording today. And I just thought it was so important about this one thing concept that you were teaching us.
Yeah. Let me make 2 responses to that. It's at this point in the story that a lot of people kind of get the feeling that Jesus is telling them that every Christ follower needs to come to Jesus by first giving away all of their possessions.
Right.
And that is not the case. Can I talk about that right now, or were you going to
go?
Let me give you a Bible example of how we know that's not the case. In the book of Acts, we meet a guy named Barnabas, and he is a very generous Christian in every way, including financially, right from the earliest days of the church in Jerusalem, giving money for the poor folks in Jerusalem. Later on in the book of Acts, in chapter 4, we see that there's another heightened need for helping out the poor monetarily. And it says that he went and sold a field up on the island of Cyprus and took the proceeds and gave it to the apostles. Clearly, when he became a Christian, he did not sell all of his possessions, because years later, he's still got some really nice property up in Cyprus that he can sell.
Exactly.
So that's just one biblical illustration of the fact that that Jesus is not teaching that every Christian, upon becoming a Christ follower, needs to divest themselves of all of their possessions.
Right.
That simply is not being taught. The other interesting thing here is about this one thing, where he tells the rich young ruler, you lack one thing, go sell your possessions, give it to the poor, and come follow me. For one thing, I think the one thing he's talking about there is not selling his possessions or giving to the poor. The one thing is following Jesus. And that, in fact, is the one thing we all need. The question is, what is the one thing for you, for me, that is the barrier to that one thing? And that could be different for all of us.
Yeah.
I think for the rich young ruler, it in fact was his materialism.
Right.
We run into that same phrase in the story of Mary and Martha, where Jesus comes to their house. They're obviously wealthy people, Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus, because they can host untold numbers of Jesus' disciples, put them up for the night. They must have a huge house and a big kitchen and all of that. Martha is busy running the show to get the food ready and the beds made for the company, while Mary is sitting listening to Jesus teach. Martha flips out, is irritated, scolds Mary, scolds Jesus. Why don't you make her help me? And Jesus says to to Martha, you lack one thing. And it's so interesting. It's the same concept, but she lacks something completely different.
Yeah.
Jesus didn't mean for her to sell her possessions and give to the poor. He meant for her to spend a little less time worrying about household matters and a little more time spending quality time with him.
Right.
He was only going to be around for another week or two.
Right.
So I think it's fascinating that my one thing may be different than your one thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Matt, do you have a comment on there?
Yeah, I just think it's great processing the commandments that Jesus pointed out first, knowing that he was able to keep all those things, and the one that was the most important was putting God, having no other idols before God. And it just exposes idols. And I just completely agree with Lee. When Jesus asked folks, if you love your mother or father more than me, and he just wants you, whether it's your possessions or your relationships or whatever it is, just to identify that thing and put him back in his rightful place first.
Right.
And when you put him first, which goes back to, seek first his kingdom, then everything else falls in line.
Right. Great.
So it's so interesting that Jesus does not say, thou shalt not covet. When he lists
He doesn't.
commandments, he leaves out the one that was probably the problem for the rich ruler.
Right.
And he let him kind of kept the fire under him. He kept waiting. Oh no, I know where this is going. He's headed for covetousness. And when he gets there, he doesn't say it.
Yeah.
Instead, he pulls honor your father and mother and puts it down there, and love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting.
Yep.
Yeah, it is. It gave him enough rope to hang himself, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay, guys, do you have any other last comments before I close this down? I learned a lot. I mean, just thinking about what my one thing is in this season of my life versus what my one thing was a couple seasons ago, and what my one thing will be in the future seasons. So I'll always be watching out for the one thing. So thanks for sharing that, Lee. It really has put some of this whole story in perspective a little differently than usual. So go ahead.
Yeah, I had a funny thought when I was looking at your manuscript, and I asked you, which translation are you using? And you're like, oh, it's mine. And I was like, that's right. You basically read your Greek New Testament and translate it as you're reading it. And I was like, that's not what a lot of people do. And that's quite a gift. And so when would we expect the Lee Magnus translation to be available to the general public?
Oh, my goodness. One of the most famous Bible translators ever was a man named Cadbury. You'll be interested to know, Matt, that he was a descendant of the Cadbury chocolate egg company.
Of course he was.
But he became a New Testament scholar, Greek scholar, and Bible translator. And when he was quite elderly, one of his students asked him what he thought the best Bible translation was. And he thought for a minute and he said, "My mother's." And the student said, "Oh, well, I knew you were a great Bible translator, but I didn't know that your mother had been." And Dr. Cadbury said, "Oh, yes, she translated it into life." So I don't plan to be producing a written translation of the New Testament, but it would be nice if I could keep working on translating it more and more into life.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I like reading it.
Yeah.
Watching on these podcasts, they're nailing it.
We like watching you live it out. You teach us every day, Lee. Thank you. So this week we're going to close a little bit differently than we usually do. We have a video for you to watch, just a few minutes long. I encourage you to take the time to watch this. It kind of closes out everything we've been talking about. So what I did was interview a friend of ours who is a member of our community, Diana Carrick, and she tells a story that happened to her in her life quite a few years ago, but she's learned from it so much, and you'll hear her tell you how much it's affected her life even today. About how she got caught up in this whole idea of materialism. But it wasn't just checking the box and getting things, it actually made her physically sick. And she could trace it all back to the moments when that slow, subtle poison got into her system, into her life, that eventually made her so sick that she had to give up her job. And God's timing was all over it to teach her these lessons. But we recorded it because sometimes when we're in the middle of all of this and you start to realize, oh, maybe I have been thinking about this too much, maybe my priorities are off. It's encouraging to hear somebody that did have that problem, but got out of it and is closer to God than she's ever been. So just to give you an hope and encouragement, and I think you'll enjoy it. So Diana, I'm going to turn it over to you. And I know that the story started with you getting into business with your brother, which sounds very innocent and very exciting. So I will let you take it from there.
All righty. Thanks so much, Diane. Yes. Many decades ago, I had started a business with my brother. It was a staffing company. He had put in the finances and I had put in the industry knowledge and the background to manage an employment type business. And as you can imagine, any startup business, it's always a rat race. You're just trying to survive. And so it was crazy the first few years and, 16, 18-hour days. But after a few years, things started to get really, better. We started to get in the black and it was becoming successful. And I mean, we were still running the rat race because it's a crazy business, but I noticed that as things started to improve and we could take a breath a little bit more, that my brother's lifestyle started to change a little bit. And he was getting a bigger home and he was getting a second home and he was getting nicer cars. And though we were sort of in an equal partnership within the business, it wasn't, I know that there were some differences financially for us, but as he got more successful, I really started to develop an envy and a jealousy that I had never seen before in myself. I had never been a jealous person, never envied, in that way. And I think that it just sent me down a bad path. I became consumed with materialism and his materialism. And I say him largely due to the fact because I spent so much of my day with him running the business. He was behind the scenes a lot. I was up front with all the and staff and employees and all the people who came to apply, et cetera. But because he was the primary person in my life, all of this was sort of in my field of vision all the time, and I couldn't let it go. And it just ate me up, and I started to resent him, and I started to seriously dislike him. And, just a little side note, prior to going into this business that lasted for over 10 years, that was kind of, demanding, I had had a strong faith, strong God, but I realized during this period that I'm speaking about now that God was absent. God wasn't absent, not to bring him into my life.
Right.
And i.e. why I was probably going down this path that I was unfamiliar with. And it became so consuming that I started to couldn't sleep. I was crying. I was developing all these horrible behaviors in my head. And I started to hate myself because I knew that this wasn't me. This wasn't what I knew. And so I just kept, forcing myself through it as much as I could. But then physically, it started to consume me. I came down with a short term, but nonetheless, sort of like an autoimmune condition. And then I started having panic attacks.
Oh my.
And I could not properly do my job, which I often got up and spoke in front of crowds and clients and sales and my staff. And I was like having like an out of body experience because the stress and the inner turmoil was just killing me. So I couldn't take it anymore. I was just pushed up against the wall. I went to my husband and said, look, I can't do this anymore. I have to leave my job. I don't care if we go broke, if we wipe out our savings account. And at that time, I was the primary breadwinner. So it was even more of a burden because carrying the weight. And it was a shock, I'm sure, to him. And it didn't come right away because I remembered having, spoke this story a little bit previously, that I spent about a year in therapy trying to talk myself into doing this. Because
Wow.
it's not something that I would typically do because all the other things come out of leaving a job and leaving your finances. And am I going to go in a hole? Are we going to go, without? Are we going to have to move? Just all these things. And so it took a long year of therapy and convincing myself, and God just kind of just pushing me up against the wall further and further. And finally, I guess I couldn't take it anymore. And with those panic attacks and the internal conditions, I just left. And thank God my, husband, God delivered, as he always does, because my husband's job started to turn around. He started to get more overtime. He had a second job, and he upped his hours with that second job. And, all my fears of going poor and doing without and not wiping out the bank account were all okay. And I just became frugal and tried to adjust our lifestyle, and it worked. And the funny thing as I wrap up is when a few months after I left my job, I got a call from my son's school that he was having some health issues that really required a mother to be around to work through, to not work 16-hour days. And so the next 8 years, I never returned to work. And I was able to help my son with this newfound, issue that we discovered he had. And it gave me time to heal and recover and get to be back to who Diana was,
Yeah.
whoever that was, because when you get wrapped up in the toxicity of materialism and envy and money and the almighty dollar, you just, you lose yourself.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened to me. And so it's good to grow as much as, it does hurt.
Yeah. Good. Well, thank you very much, Diana,
You're
for
welcome.
joining us on this. And I'm sure that it'll help lots of people. So I appreciate
Oh, well,
you
I
doing
hope
it.
so.
Okay.
Thanks for
See ya.
helping.
See
All
you
right.
soon.
Bye-bye. You got it, Diane. See ya.